We are really privileged to have Baiju Bhatt join us today. He's currently got a wild venture that if it succeeds, it's going to change the world. Basically a space-based commercial solar energy initiative that is going to be amazing. And I think he's got a track record that lends us to believe he might be able to pull it off. But pretty well known for co-founding Robinhood with his, was it your roommate at Stanford that you co-founded?
Oh yeah.
Roommate at Stanford, so all you guys, look, your roommates, you guys can make it big. And you know the Robinhood story, just wildly successful zero commission stock trading platform. Grew up around space. His dad worked at NASA. I think it was in Virginia. Is that where he grew up? Beiju. And came out to California and lives out of Half Moon Bay. He's got 3 boys. I'm a big believer in that. But just an amazing story, Beiju. And thanks for sharing with us and inspiring all of us here with what you've done. And over to you, Ernestine.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Joe, for that. So back in 1941, a famous sci-fi writer first imagined a future where we could beam solar power from space down to Earth. And now I guess it's 80 years later, and that vision is starting to finally look like a reality, thanks to Beiju and what he's building at Aetherflux. So essentially, from what I understand, it's building constellations of small satellites that can beam power down using infrared lasers and delivering high output to compact receivers on the ground. Why this is significant, we're of course using more energy than ever before, and kind of the need for a replacement for alternatives to fossil fuels. Space-based solar power has been explored probably, I guess, maybe since the 1970s, but a lot of the efforts have just really not worked. Been more academic, and Aetherflux is taking a different approach to that. So I sort of described what you're doing, but maybe you could tell us more about founding vision for Aetherflux. What are you working on? What led you down the path to deciding to start this company?
Yeah. So start out by maybe talking a little bit about the motivation behind it, and then go from there into the sort of technical implementation or what the actual idea is. So the motivation for them started, for me personally, actually at a pretty young age in life. So I grew up with my dad, my family moving to the U.S. from India. So my dad wanted to study physics. So he started studying physics at the University of Huntsville, Alabama, which is where I grew up. And then he worked at NASA, Langley Air Force Base, as a research scientist through all of my childhood. So I kind of grew up with that as a backdrop, and I came here to study physics and math, physics as an undergrad, math in graduate school. And through that experience, I kind of had this moment as a kid being like, what happened to the space race? It totally happened before I became an adult, and it just seems like it sort of was a thing of the past. And if the space race was to ever happen again, or more specifically, if commercial space were ever to happen again, it was something that I felt really passionate that I wanted to be a part of. Now, the idea behind Aetherflux was a few different things. I would say through one perspective, it was to look for an idea that was squarely in the realm of science fiction, or kind of had existed in the realm of science fiction, and see if there was a way of making that science reality. And the idea of collecting power in space and beaming power, I mean, these are the things of sci-fi fantasy dreams, right? Yeah. It's the cool stuff that you want to be working on, if it's possible. And I think the version of sort of space sort of power beaming or space lasers, I just think of things like Star Wars. That's not how it works. The idea was to see if there was an idea like that could become reality, and also to look at it through the lens of how do we make the space race a reality today, right? And I think this is where the experience of building Robinhood factors more into the concept behind it. And the idea was how is there an opportunity to both find one of these ideas that was in the realm of sort of science fiction that you can make science reality, but also find an opportunity where if you could do it, you would increase the economic envelope in space. Because I fundamentally believe that when you can create commercial activities around whatever the thing is, it's going to accelerate the rate of progress really dramatically. Now, coming back to the idea of space solar power, right? It was one of those things that kind of, from my perspective, it sort of fit nicely into a lot of those things, because it is an idea that when you think about it, it has its little place in science fiction, that we hope to make science reality. But also, if you think about the total scope of economic activity that's happening in space, as it exists today, this is a very simplified view, but a lot of it falls into the buckets of telecommunications, Earth imaging / academia research, and defense, right? That can't be it. Like, that can't be the full extent of what humans do in space. And if you could take this idea, which was originally a NASA DoD idea, and make it a reality, that would actually be a thing that would unlock a tremendous amount, or has the potential to unlock a tremendous amount of commercial activity in space. So I keep going, but
how does your approach differ from kind of like these past attempts like NASA that you're describing, or like DARPA? Like, what are you doing differently?
Yeah. So for those unfamiliar, the original concept, or I guess the sort of more modern version of space solar power that many folks have heard of, just a show of hands, who here is familiar with the concept of space solar power before this? Okay, like half-ish. The idea was, I think, sort of born of the idea of solar technology, which was one of the original applications was actually in satellites, right? But could you collect power in space and find a way of addressing some of the limitations with terrestrial solar power? Meaning, could you find a way to put it somewhere in space where it would be able to project power on a nearly continuous basis, or could you pick a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that would let you sort of pass power down largely uninterrupted? So this was the idea of microwave-based space solar power in geostationary or geosynchronous orbits. Originally an idea from NASA from the 1970s and Department of Energy in the 1970s. That doesn't exist, right? It's not a new idea. It's been around for kind of a long time. It doesn't exist. And my view is that one of the reasons that it doesn't exist is that particular design is real difficult to get started. If you just look at it through basic physics analysis, right, is like, how big do the apertures have to be to do something like this? You quickly arrive at things where you have to build structures the size of, small cities, like 500 acres in space. And when you put that thing together is when you can start using it. We're not there right now as a society, and we certainly weren't there in the 1970s, the 1980s. Our approach is actually to say, is there a way that you could do it where you could start small and accomplish the same goals? And since the idea was born, are there other technologies that have emerged that give us other ways of doing it?
So what are some of the technologies?
So our approach there is to actually use small satellites, a constellation of them in low Earth orbit, and to beam the power down with IR lasers. So infrared, in our case, fiber lasers. And the benefits of that are you get to, one, distribute the power generation and the power distribution across a lot of different satellites. And it allows for much, much smaller spot sizes on the ground. And I guess the most important one is that you can do this on a pretty small scale and actually get that first sort of like notch of actually beaming power down from space.
Are there any sort of like efficiency losses along the way, or?
Lots of efficiency losses along the way.
How do you think about that?
Well, one of the fundamental things here is that the supply is abundant, right? Like, the supply doesn't cost anymore. So it actually, the thing that matters not so much is not, the efficiency matters in that it has a direct impact on the spacecraft design and the thermodynamics. But the thing you ultimately care about is what is the power density that you can deliver on the ground. And so in many ways you have efficiency losses when sunlight hits the solar panels, right? And then the solar panels convert that to electricity, and then you go through a laser system which has its own efficiency hit. Then there's an efficiency hit through the atmosphere. And then there's an efficiency hit when you get down to the ground to rectify the power. But ultimately, you're collecting sunlight, which is abundant and doesn't cost any more in space.
So have a question from the audience that we collected beforehand. Like, how do we know Aetherflux is not just a sci-fi idea and actually feasible?
I mean, I think my view on it is that until you get stuff in space, you're an aspiring space company. And so our approach is to get stuff into space on what we think is the shortest and most direct path. So we're working towards launching our first satellite that's going to demonstrate this capability next year, right? So we have working with a company called Apex that's making the satellite bus. We're working to actually integrate the laser system, the optics, build the ground station, put all the pieces together, and actually show that this isn't hinged on an individual scientific breakthrough. It's like pretty much squarely an engineering problem.
So another audience question, do you plan to use Apex buses long-term or eventually move to sort of in-house bus production?
So we'll continue to use Apex as we build and test the technology, but when we think of the future designs of what space solar power looks like, that's not going to be a small satellite, right? That's going to require its own bespoke design. So we will be developing that stuff in-house. But for now, we have a great relationship with them.
Yeah. Any other key partners you're working with on the technology side that you can share?
Yeah, we're working with a lot of different partners. We're working with partners to help develop the laser systems, working with partners to eventually build some of the ground station technology, vendors for all the individual components, like batteries and the compute units and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about just like the use cases. So we touched a little bit upon more like these sort of like military use cases. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of like go-to-market kind of use case for Aetherflux long term?
So the two primary markets when we think about it are DoD applications, and in particular, you can imagine things like getting power into the battlefield, right? So the way the U.S. military gets power out to forward deployed bases, to all these austere places that they're operating, the bread and butter of it is actually diesel fuel and generators. And the big problem with it is, one, it's dangerous. Two, you're burning fuel to transport fuel. And in a lot of cases, to do it safely, you actually end up having to transport that fuel with things like air transit, which can both be very expensive and very cumbersome. So in those cases, and again, many of the sort of inspirations and concepts for how we're implementing this are from working with the Department of Defense. So one of the things that we've previously talked about is that our program has been approved for funding by the DoD. And the idea there is rather than having to bring fuel into the battlefield, you're actually able to bring a small, compact receiver to get the power down, and the actual power generation is all done in orbit, in low Earth orbit. And so you're able to get these ground stations that are going to be small, portable, ideally of relatively little strategic value if captured by an adversary, and able to generate and rectify high power density on the ground, right? And in turn, you kind of are able to cut out the supply chain of getting fuel out into the battlefield, which, you know, if you think about the places where there either is conflict or where the U.S. government is projecting where there might be conflict in the future, you know, take Indo-Pacific, for example, or even places in the Middle East, right? It fundamentally changes the dynamics by which any such conflict is sort of navigated, right? Because the traditional attack vector of attacking the supply chain lines, our approach has the potential to render that somewhat ineffective.
Yeah. So I guess in these sort of like contested environments, like how do you ensure resilience or protection of your systems from some sort of interference or attack?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, it's a constellation in low Earth orbit. So the whole thing is decentralized. And you see this with Starlink, right? Where you can't disrupt Starlink by knocking out an individual satellite. That doesn't make any sense because there's another one right behind it, another one right behind it, another one right behind it. Our approach is trying to get to a similar sort of outcome where you have one satellite that's beaming power to a given ground station, and as it moves out of the field of view, you've got one behind it that's beaming power, and it's sort of a continuous handoff between different satellites. I think that's one of the big things. The other thing is that the actual beam of power as it passes through the atmosphere, you know, we're targeting a beam size that's 5 to 10 meters in diameter, and that's relatively small, right? And it's not like an electromagnetic communication signal, which is being projected out. It's a collimated beam of light.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Yeah. So another audience question, do you see Aetherflux as part of a broader shift in how energy logistics is conducted in modern warfare?
I would say it's not just that, but it's broader than that, right? I think there are all these trends that the U.S. government and other governments are talking about where more of the battlefield is going to be electrified. And this, I think, somewhat obviously plays a role in that. But I'll actually make it a little broader, right? Is that we think that if you fast forward the clock 5, 10, 15 years in the future, and we think about how humanity is going to generate power, I think it's fairly obvious that the sun is going to be the ubiquitous source of power. That's going to be a big part of that overall mix. And we fundamentally believe that if you look at the two different approaches, as we see them, right, of bolting your solar panels to the ground or putting them in orbit, putting them in orbit has tremendous benefits because it allows delivering power when the sun isn't shining, right? It allows delivering power with a small footprint on the ground. And ideally, it allows delivering a significant amount of power without having to build huge infrastructure on the ground.
Yeah. What do you think are kind of like the biggest, what do you feel like is the biggest bottleneck to scaling deployment, say like a couple years down the road? Do you feel like it's going to be regulatory, or is it going to be like cost or like technical, or what do you anticipate as kind of, I know you're like solving like a massive challenge, but is there, like if you had to pick one of the three, like what do you feel like is the biggest challenge?
I think they're all pretty challenging. I mean, I think first things first, right? This is a difficult problem. Like this is not easy. This is a very difficult technical problem, business problem, regulatory problem, operational problem. And we have an audience of students in the room. So if you want to work on something hard, get in touch with us because we're hiring. And I mean that very seriously. And I think that really hard problems tend to attract ambitious people that want to work on really hard problems. So, you know, as we look forward in the future, like, yeah, we're going to have to manufacture a ton of satellites to meet the demands of this technology when, and if we're able to demonstrate it does all these things, right, that's going to be very challenging. I think being able to operate a huge fleet of satellites, there's not a lot of examples of that that exist in the world outside of Starlink. But that's exciting. Yeah.
Are there other challenges we haven't touched on, like orbital debris, or like how do you think about some of these other challenges?
Yeah. I'll sip water. There's a lot of challenges. I mean, I think things like orbital debris, as we get more and more stuff in space, it's going to be a problem that emerges more and more. I think that's sort of in the future, and we'll see how that plays out. I think as we even think about the technical challenges involved in doing this, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. I think we talked about the efficiency a few minutes ago, and that actually creates a really significant and interesting technical challenge because every bit of efficiency hit that we get on the satellite is heat, right? And every bit of heat that we get on the satellite, we have to do something with. Because satellites are, the way that heat is managed on a satellite is fundamentally very different than it exists on Earth. You can't blow air on the thing, there's no air to blow on it. So you have to literally radiate the heat away. I think that those kinds of technical challenges are going to be super interesting and difficult to work through, right? And it's not just the heat management side of it, but it's also the efficiency of the underlying components that generate the heat. Taking high power amplification at these infrared frequencies that we're doing, right? And making it more efficient and making the production costs cheaper and being able to produce high power IR lasers in really large capacity, being able to step up the power level to be able to meet the needs of not just the battlefield, but also, you know, very much worth emphasizing that we intend to build a commercial energy company here in the future as well. That's a big part of what our vision is. That's going to require a lot of energy, right? A lot of energy. So.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely not afraid of tackling big challenges, as we've seen with even just building Robinhood. So I guess with Robinhood, what sort of lessons did you learn from that experience of, obviously starting a very successful company that you're now taking to Aetherflux?
Man, a lot of lessons learned in building that company. So a couple that come to mind. I think a few that are relevant to this audience here. So I started Robinhood with my roommate from Stanford, and we actually would take many long walks around Stanford campus and talk about the ideas that were involved. We would also recruit pretty actively from the university. And so I think one of the lessons is betting on really exceptional, high growth talent early in their careers, right? Like that is one of the things that if you're working on something really new and really disruptive, like those are the kinds of people I've seen are the ones within the organization that are not afraid to tackle problems that maybe if you've done it for 30 years, you're like, oh man, I don't even know if this is possible. But a lot of times you'll see people that are early in their careers that are just like, let's try it. Let's see if we can do it. So having a robust university recruiting program, I think, is a big lesson. I think, so that's kind of on the more narrow side, right? On the bigger side, I think the biggest lesson is dreaming big, right? And it's...
Do you feel like you didn't dream big enough for Robinhood?
No, I thought Robinhood was a big dream, but I think learning from that, at the time we were talking about, yeah, that was a pretty big dream. At the time we were talking about taking on the entire established financial services industry as two college friends and a ragtag group of engineers and compliance people and designers, right? And we were able to transform that industry, right? And not shying away from those kinds of problems and having the sort of foresight looking at this problem to say, if you look at a problem that at first pass looks really challenging, right? And you look at another problem that at first pass, you're like, yeah, I can kind of see how this might work. I can see how the pieces would fit together for this to happen. Dream big. That's kind of the lesson, right? Is that when you actually get to building the thing, the difference between doing something that seems really hard and something that seems more proximate, when you actually get down to doing it, building companies is just hard. Like you're gonna encounter a lot of hard along the way. And if you're not dreaming as big as you can, you're still gonna be working as hard and working through a different set of challenges, but maybe on something that has a smaller sort of impact that it can have on the world.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, both Robinhood and Aetherflux, very ambitious.
Yeah, I'd like to
efforts.
think so.
Well, definitely. Anything that's been easier this time around starting a company, or conversely, like harder this time around?
I mean, I think both are pretty challenging. I mean, I've done this before, right? So there's some muscle memory that comes with pattern matching of working with investors, right? And how to raise capital for the company that you're starting. It's not the same doing it the second time around. I kind of that one is one that have lots of relationships already and kind of know how to stair step the growth of a company, right? So we announced kind of recently that we actually just closed $50 million in outside capital for Aetherflux, in addition to the $10 million I put in to start the company. Yeah. So, getting to that point with Robinhood was pretty challenging.
Now everyone wants to throw money at you.
It's cool to be able to do it.
Yeah, definitely. For a lot of founders, aspiring founders in the room, any sort of lessons, suggestions you recommend for someone who's starting a company today?
Yeah. Interesting. For folks starting companies today, I think the landscape changes, but the people that tend to pull out ahead tend to be the ones that are very persistent and really hardworking. And so regardless of like whether there's advancements in AI that can write all the code for you, or the market segments and distributions change, like there is absolutely no substitute for hard work. And the people that have it within them to say, hard problem, like nose to the grindstone, I'm gonna work at it, I'm gonna chip away at it bit by bit by bit, those are the people that pull ahead. And just never changes, in my opinion.
Definitely, definitely.